flip this thing into presentation mode? Great, thanks. So today I'm going to talk about restoration, forest complexity, and the role that big trees play in our understanding of complexity, and perhaps the role that they ought to play in our consideration of restoring the forests of the West. So, forests are naturally complex. All of us have walked around in forests, and we can see that they differ from place to place. And we need to think about that in the context of restoration, because a lot of things that have happened in the past century or century and a half may have really simplified the forest that we see today. And those could be things like fire exclusion or the reintroduction of fire, logging, overgrazing, lots of things that we have done either as acts of commission or acts of omission may have simplified the forest structure. And what do I mean by forest structure? I mean two things. I mean the vertical structure of the forest, the height of the forest, the canopy strata that are present, the size of the trees that make up those strata, and also the landscape patch distribution. How patchy is the forest from place to place? Are there places where there are patches of large trees and openings, or is it all sort of one homogeneous plantation-like situation? So there are these elements of structure, and we're just now starting to have some tools that enable us to look at these in a quantitative way. So I'd like to do that, and in the lens of sort of what is characterizing forests of the West. Our forests are very unique in the world, and I'm going to focus on the characters of not all Western forests. I'd like to be able to do that someday, but some forests on the Pacific slope of North America. I'm going to use as examples two Smithsonian-affiliated forest dynamics plot, one in Wind River, Washington, which is a Douglas fir western hemlock forest, and one in the Yosemite, Sierra Nevada, which is a sugar pine white fir forest. And both of those, these are primary forests, both were quite extensive areas or types of forest cover before we moved into those areas and logged a lot of them. But these will be the examples I'll be using, and there are some really important characteristics, unique characteristics of these forests. And the most important one is that they are comprised of large persistent structures. Of course, this includes the big trees. Trees in these forests, not even really special trees, but just the larger emergence, are up to 200 centimeters in diameter, breast height, 60 to 80 meters tall. But with big trees comes big snags. When those trees die, they remain standing for many years. And then after they have been standing for many years, they fall and lie on the ground. And all of the stages of those large persistent structures are very important to forest ecosystem function and subsequent forest development. So, pattern and process. If we're looking at restoration, there's a lot of different things we could be looking at restoring. Basic function, species composition, abundance of rare plants. But we might also really want to look specifically at complexity, because the complexity of structure might be at least partially responsible for determining some of the niches that herbs, plants, vertebrates, and invertebrates use. And I think what we can do with primary forests, it'd be very hard to get those primary forests back, but we can take data from those forests and use lessons from these complex forests to help us understand what might be a good way to look at a restoration or to look at the success of a restoration. And I think what we really want to do is, we might not be able to restore all of the complexity, but let's avoid making it worse, right? Let's not preclude conditions that we know exist in these complex forests. And let's tolerate the kind of spatial variation in structure and temporal variation in process that we know happen all the time, or not all the time, but happen in these primary forests. So given that we can take some lessons from the primary forest, we might now turn to structural heterogeneity itself and say, like, well, what is responsible for structural heterogeneity? And certainly things like mortality processes, we all know that different mortality agents create heterogeneity in forests. So I'll definitely return to mortality as a creator of heterogeneity. But there might be a very simple lens we could look at forest structure, the variability in forest structure with, and that lens might just be, where are the big trees? I'm going to define big trees here as more than 1 meter in diameter. These are big forests. But maybe just knowing where the big trees are tells us a lot about the heterogeneity of forests. So I'll give a little more detail about the structure of the 2 example forests. This is Wind River. At the bottom, we see a LiDAR-derived canopy image. You can see there's quite a bit of variation in there. The plots are 25 hectares. This one has got 31,000 woody stems that have been mapped. It's about 1,200 stems per hectare. That's at a 1 centimeter cutoff. You might be more familiar with a 4-inch cutoff. There'd be half as many stems at that cutoff. Biomass is very large in these forests, 650 megagrams per hectare live, about 800 live and dead. The forest height is 65 meters, 60 to 65 meters. And pretty much the forest cover is relatively continuous. Open areas are maintained by wind or snow damage, and root rot pockets is sort of what's going on. And you can see in the LiDAR-derived canopy image places where there are not very many trees and patches where the trees are quite large. Here's a LiDAR-derived profile of the same forest, and canopy cover here is thick, 70 to 95%, but I'd say more towards the high end of that. They're very dark forests with very deep crowns on some of the trees, a very high leaf area index overall, and the trees are old. This forest was established by a stand-initiating event about 500 years old, and many trees are about that age. Yosemite has its similarities and its differences. The plot is the same size. It has a few more stems. Still, the ratio, if you were looking at a 4-inch or a 10 centimeter cutoff, there'd be half as many as the 1,300 indicated there. Similarly high biomass, almost exactly the same height distribution of the emergence. But here, the open areas are maintained by rocky outcrops, evidence of past fire, and wind and snow damage as well. See, the canopy looks different. This is the same kind of profile as 2 slides ago, but in the Sierra Nevada, the canopy is much more open, 40 to 90%, with say 65 to 75% being the usual cover. And surprisingly, given the amount of fire and the different tree species, the oldest trees here are also about 500 years old, but they're not really as many of the 500-year-old trees, so perhaps most of them are 200 to 300. So, heterogeneity. Again, what's causing it? There's the usual suspects, and this is what people will usually look for, well, I look for too. The contribution of topography, or just latitude, the light environment, climate, soils, and the various disturbances to heterogeneity. But I'm going to come back to the big trees. Where are they? That might really tell us a lot. And then how did they get there? Okay, that's a tease, because I don't have an answer to that today. We'd really like to know why the big trees are where they are. But I think that's a very complex problem that we hope we can accumulate enough data to look at. And it's similar to the climate situation. We want to see what happened 500 years ago that allowed these big trees to grow. We just don't have enough data to figure that out yet. But we certainly know where the big trees are. They're very easy to find. So we can apply some tools to that. And we can quantify heterogeneity both by aggregate measures in terms of the variation in density and basal area that many people do. But we can also look at spatial pattern. And we can look at spatial pattern of the forest as a whole, or we can look at spatial pattern of the big trees. Maybe the big trees have different patterns from the little trees. I mean, they might be the same, or it might be that big trees, because of their size and their longevity, might be inherently different than the smaller trees in the forest. So here's a typical aggregate measure of variation in the Wind River plot. This is simply dividing the Wind River plot into 640 20 meter by 20 meter quadrats and looking at density and basal area within each one. And density is shown with the gray box plot on the left, and basal area, the gray in the box plot on the right. And there's a mean density, and typically in these forests, the 95th percentile is about twice as much, and the maximum is about 3 times as much. And for basal area, the 95th percentile of basal area is about twice as much as the mean, and the maximum is a little more than 3 times as much. I'm showing data here for the species for Wind River. It looks almost exactly the same for Yosemite. And I was very interested in these relationships between the mean and the 95th percentile and the maximum. In the Smithsonian network of large plots all over the world, these numbers are actually very, very strikingly uniform around the world when considering this kind of grain and extent. So here's some spatial data. And what we said here was, let's look at the patterning. And we looked at a comparison between aggregation or dispersion compared to spatial randomness. And I'm showing the L-hat statistic here, but the important thing to note is if the data, the black line, is above the gray simulation envelope, it's indicating clumpiness, and if it's below, it's indicating dispersion. And here are the shade-tolerant trees for both Yosemite and Wind River. And perhaps to no one's surprise, small trees are clumped at very small spatial scales. The inter-tree distance is shown here on the x-axis. So we have clumping of the shade-tolerant trees, the small shade-tolerant trees in these plots. And now on the right, if we look at the large diameter trees, those 1 meter in diameter and greater, we see that they're both clumped and dispersed, depending on how you look at it. So down in the lower area, we see a strong inhibition out to about 7 meters for western hemlock, large diameter western hemlock. But in contrast, here for white fir, we see strong evidence of clumping, even up to 40 meters. So the large trees are behaving differently from the small trees and not necessarily the same species to species. I also wanted to point out a few limitations. These spatial statistics are good up to 1/4 of the dimension of your smallest plot dimension. So 25 meters is what you can get out of a 1 hectare plot. And the spatial statistics don't really work too well if the population is much below 100. So we needed a lot of data to look for these spatial patterns and to look for species-specific and size-specific patterns in them. Then we wanted to say, well, does where the big trees are really matter? So we did a simulation experiment where we kept the location of all the 98% of the small trees in the same place, and then we repositioned the big trees. We took them out and we repositioned them randomly based on inhibition or aggregation patterns, and we looked at their effect on heterogeneity, which we judged by 2 measures, coefficient of variation and skewness of basal area. And what we found, I've circled here the 400 meter squared quadrat size, changing the way the big trees are positioned on the landscape has a huge effect on the variation in structure in the forest. Almost a factor of 2 in coefficient of variation, and a very, very large, almost a complete determinant on skewness. So where the big trees are really matters, and if there was a process that moved around the big trees, it would be very important to overall heterogeneity. Okay, so that's sort of where the trees are. Mortality is what happens to them. So mortality can introduce heterogeneity very quickly, and even an infrequent event for us, decadal, is very frequent for trees that live 300 to 500 years. So a lot of these agents might not be well characterized by small plot studies, and we might be able to get more information from these big plots. So here's a little example. A tree falls in the woods. You cannot get a mortality process more simple than that. And here I'm showing a tree from one of those plots in a typical 1 hectare monitoring plot. A lot of people have those. But if it falls, best case, a lot of the tree is outside of a typical 1 hectare plot. So that's clearly not enough to examine all of the effects. But really, crushing mortality, or the effect of one tree falling, is much more complex. And it's going to take a large sample size to be able to decouple the often delayed mortality that results from crushing mortality. So again, this is about as simple as you can get, one tree falling, and we're going to be repeating this over hundreds and hundreds of years. And here's some pictures, one from Wind River and one from Yosemite, of these wind throw events. They're once or twice a decade in the Cascades. I think we're all pretty familiar with that. But the picture on the right indicates a mono wind event from Yosemite once every 30 years, which can be quite extensive. And again, all these trees would have experienced this many times. Fire, in many areas, it's mixed severity, or the characteristic fire severity is mixed. Large diameter trees often survive. And we shouldn't forget, the wind and fire maybe are the ones that cause a lot of immediate change, but the bark beetles are always with us. They're always involved in a lot of the mortalities because the beetles are always sort of piling on. They're involved in these mortalities even not at epidemic levels. Similarly, the pathogens act slowly, but they're always with us and perhaps contribute a lot to the mechanical mortalities we see. So if we think about all of these different causes of mortality, or these different agents that are involved in the tree death, who was involved? We can look at some of the data and say, how does the mortality change the forest? How is that mortality different? And then what is the role of the big trees? So this is a table of 2 years of mortality in Yosemite. The top part is all the trees, all the mortalities. And if you look at the total, 550 mortalities in each year. If you were just looking at the total number of trees that died, it would look like mortality is the same. Not very interesting. But we can see, in terms of basal area, there's a huge difference in terms of the size, or the total amount of material that was killed in 1 year versus another. 2012 was the mono wind event, which killed a lot of big trees. So we can see, even looking at all the trees, that if we're starting to look at the causes of mortality, or the agents involved in mortality, that there is quite a bit of difference. But now if you look at this bottom half of the chart, that shows just the big trees. Just 4 mortalities in 2011, and 12 mortalities in 2012. But if you look over at the basal area and the proportion of the total that's comprised by the big trees, almost everything, all the change in basal area is driven by the mortality of the big trees, and furthermore, the differences from year to year are driven by those differences. So in 2011, the 4 big trees were 1/3 of the basal area that died, and in 2012, it was 2/3. So the changes in forest structure are almost totally due to the changes in those small percentage of big trees that die. So what can we conclude? Well, old-growth forests are heterogeneous, in a lot of ways, from casual observation to statistical analysis. Big trees have patterns, and they have patterns at relatively large spatial scales that are still significant. And the heterogeneity in basal area and the change in basal area is almost totally driven by the top 1 to 2% of trees. So we should probably pay attention to those 1 to 2% of the largest trees. And this has some implications for restoration. So first, I think we should think about using the available information on spatial heterogeneity, and we should think about using the information we have about temporal variation in mortality. But in fact, we have very, very little information of this nature. People are just starting to do that. There's some good work by my colleagues Derek Churchill and Andrew Larson. But using spatial data in restorations is really in its infancy, and we should try to use as much as we can. But we should be very careful doing that because there's still great uncertainty. And because of the great uncertainty, we shouldn't think that we have a solution, and we should be very cautious, and we should be sure that we don't do the same thing everywhere, which is a famous quote from Jerry. And in all the restoration prescriptions that we're thinking of, last but not least, I would like to suggest that we all grow some big trees, because those are what's really driving a lot of the heterogeneity in the forest. So if people would like more information about what we're doing with the big trees, I'd like to encourage you to visit our web presence. I'd also here like to acknowledge and thank my co-PIs, Andrew Larson of the University of Montana, Mark Swanson of Washington State University, James Freund of University of Washington, and the 160 students, volunteers, and staff that got that data. And I'd like to give a very special acknowledgement to Jerry Franklin, who not only was my major professor, but is the major professor of all 4 of the PIs for this research. Thank you very much.
We have a few minutes for questions.
Sure.
I'm just wondering if you could read your website out loud.
Oh, sorry. The Yosemite Forest Dynamics plot is yfdp.org, and the Wind River Forest Dynamics plot is wfdp.org. Yes?
Do you want to say something about your hopes to establish a plot in Utah?
Yes, I have hopes to establish a plot in Utah. It already has a website, ufdp.org, but there's nothing there. Yeah, the idea is, if we look at the West and primary forests throughout the West, the Pacific slope has a certain dynamic and a certain climate, and certainly the interior West, the Colorado Plateau, or the mixed conifer here in Utah, or the mixed conifer up in Montana, sort of complete the picture. And I'll be looking to put in a plot here in Utah, and my colleague Andrew Larson will be looking to put in a plot in Montana. So our goal is to have these 4 plots where we can explicitly look at the spatial dynamics of community change and forest development.
What do you need to get that done, Jim?
We'll talk later. We need a little money, a lot of people. It takes about 10,000 hours of field work to put in one of these plots. So we're looking to get all that together. We've made some progress. We're scoping things out, trying to get the resources together, but we're really, really excited about the kinds of things we could do here in the Colorado Plateau. Really exciting mixed conifer. That's a major priority of mine, is to try to get that going. Yes.
Jim, do you want to say anything about what happened to the Yosemite plot this year?
Yeah, the Yosemite plot had fire exclusion for about 80 years, up until 3 weeks ago. The Rim Fire complex did burn through Yosemite, but it was not taken as part of the wildfire. The Park Service, in a pretty gutsy move, did a nighttime backfire of the whole watershed containing the plot. And so we took a very characteristic ecological burn there without any preparation, no snagging, no fire lines through the plot. They let it burn all the way through. So we have the most extensive data collection, pre-fire data collection for anything in the West. And hopefully we've got a decade or 2 decades of just great post-fire dynamics to follow. Yes?
So We've been talking a bit with different speakers of defining what they mean by certain terms today. So I was just wondering if you would describe what you mean with the term restoration.
Well, I mean, I think, if we think about forests, or any ecosystem, they have a characteristic composition, structure, and function. And when I think about restoration, I think about getting as close as possible to where that ecosystem could be. But explicit, more about just can we restore all of the functions that are possible, that are a possibility for that system. So I'm not talking about any particular set of reference conditions. I'm not talking about whether we could start today and even grow a tree that big anymore with climate changing the way it is. But just can we get closer to where this ecosystem could be? And I think big trees are a distinctive part of ecosystem function, in terms of reproduction, in terms of providing habitat, for other species. So I guess that's where I'm thinking about it. I don't think about restoration very much. I think about the lessons we can learn from primary forests, and then maybe comparing a forest that is in a different state and saying, well, what are the differences between this primary forest and this one, that had been burned 50 years ago or that had been logged 50 years ago. Was that sort of where you were going? Or? Yes?
Following up on that idea of defining terms, I just wanted to bring up this definition of large trees, and especially in the context of your plans of expanding this work to other areas. So, for example, in the Colorado Plateau, what we may call a large tree, you guys might not even notice, and California.
Right. No, that's a really excellent point, and I'm actually working on a structural comparison of all 40 of the Smithsonian plots right now. And clearly when you're talking about different taxa in vastly different regions, you can't take an absolute, an absolute diameter cutoff and get very much with it. So I think the way to go in comparison of forests globally is to look at percentiles. So we could, we could probably all agree that the top 1 percentile of trees, maybe that's a special class of tree in a primary forest. So that's what I do when I have to compare across different forest types. If I'm looking at Panama and Cameroon and Wind River, I have to take a percentile approach. It just so happens that Yosemite and Wind River, the same diameter cutoff, gets you about 1.5% of the trees. But that's really, if we're considering sort of the elite class of tree that approaches the limit of longevity and the limit of size for that species in that particular environment, that's sort of what I mean by big trees, things that have been very successful in that environment, that may be reproductively successful, and that may be structuring the local community.